If you're new to the hobby of collecting records, welcome. There are some myths that I'm here to myth bust or debunk for you. If you're a veteran of the hobby, you might learn something in this video as well, but what you can do is drop a comment below with other misinformation that you might have heard. So if someone's new to collecting and they stumble on this video, they can just go read all the comments after they watch the video and be fully informed to take their first steps or their first few steps into the vinyl world. So hopefully these things you may or may not have heard will save you some headaches when I tell you the truth behind them. The first is, if you have a bad turntable or a low quality one, basically one that doesn't have a counterweight on the back, which is the little weight that helps you adjust the arm on certain turntables that allow you to do so, people tell you, oh, the needle on those is bad, but you could just replace it. That is just not true. The needles that come on those suitcase players and players of that caliber, they fit the tone arm weight that is adjusted at the factory. Every cartridge tracks differently in terms of how much weight it needs to be at when you're balancing the arm. And if you don't have a counterweight, you have no way of adjusting the arm. So you can't take a Crosley and throw an Ortofon Red on there. It's just not going to work. The weight is not going to be proper. It's either going to cause your records to skip, or it's going to slam the grooves and damage the cartridge and or your record. So you cannot really get upgrades on those turntables, unfortunately, despite what anyone says, which is why I always recommend starting with a table like the Fluance RT81 or the Technica LP120, because the 60 doesn't have a counterweight, because then if you like it, you can upgrade bits and pieces as you go. Number 2, taping a coin on top of your needle will help skipping. This is an old thing from the 70s, before people really thought too much about how sound quality or how gear can be affected by mistreating it, and this is absolutely mistreating your gear. While it may solve a skipping problem temporarily, this is going to be damaging the needle and potentially damaging the record over time. You're not meant to overtrack to overcompensate for skipping. Skipping happens on low quality turntables, which is often what people get into the hobby with, because the tone arm is not at the right weight or the right balance for certain records. For example, a 140 gram and a 180 gram record are going to be different thicknesses, so it may be harder to track the 180 gram, and you might see some skipping on that for some reason. Putting a coin on the needle is a short fix. It's a quick fix, but it's not a good fix. The real fix is to upgrade your turntable to something where you can properly weight the arm so it balances properly and plays all your records without issues. I know this for a fact because I had an LP60 when I first started back in the day, and all the records that were skipping for me played perfectly when I got a new turntable. Speaking of 180 gram, the next thing I want to talk about is that 180 gram sounds better. That is objectively false. 180 gram is a buzzword that a lot of the industry uses to cover up bad mastering or bad sourcing for a record, or just something that's a kind of low quality product but happens to be a higher weight. The weight of the record is not really a big deal, because I have records that are really paper thin from the 70s that are rich and lush, and I have some that are 180 gram that sound like garbage. It is not a end-all be-all, this will sound good because it is 180 grams, so don't get sucked into this marketing tactic of, oh, it's 180 gram, it must be a good sounding pressing. Where it was mastered, who mastered it, and the source of the actual material is far more important. Also worth mentioning is that 180 gram records are thicker, so some people say they're harder to warp. I've noticed that oftentimes when I order 180 gram records, they'll come in and they will be a little warped. I think it might be because it's thicker within the jacket, and if the jacket doesn't have enough room, when they're all loaded onto a pallet in their box, they're pressing together more, and if the temperature isn't right in the warehouse, or if they're a little too tightly squeezed in, it can cause warps to be more prominent. So I've actually had bad experience with 180 gram versus a standard weight. So your mileage may vary there, but do not think 180 gram is equivalent to a high quality record. And that leads into my next 3 things. Let's talk about warps for a second. Some people think that all warped records are unplayable, and occasionally they are. I did a video recently about the most annoying things about collecting vinyl, and one of them is that almost all records I get these days are a little warped. Not necessarily a giant warp where like across the platter or your needle's jumping off of it, but just enough where you're looking at it and you see it kind of not spinning flatly. And people that are particular about that kind of stuff like me, it can drive us crazy if you stare at it, but you don't need to stare at the record while it's spinning. You need to listen to it. And if it sounds good and it's tracking properly on your turntable, a little warp is not the end of the world. You can sometimes fix it by putting it in between books or under box sets. Some people have luck with that. I've never tried it myself, but there are ways to fix minor warps over time, but ultimately I just ignore them and enjoy the music. If the music sounds bad because of a warp, or if your needle can't stay on the record, that's an issue. But the second one I just mentioned is not necessarily because of the record. It's sometimes because of your turntable. A lot of lower quality entry-level turntables cannot track warps very well, so they'll be bouncing off. But if you upgraded to an entry table like a Fluance or something that's a little better than that, you will be able to probably track that warp. So you really have to make sure your gear isn't the issue. And the next two are very similar, and I've done videos on the first one I'm about to mention before, but a lot of people are telling newbies to the hobby that colored vinyl sounds worse than black vinyl. Well, I've done a video on this in the past, but hate to break it to you, black vinyl is colored vinyl. Vinyl inherently has no color, and black is added to it to make it black. So every record is colored vinyl in a way. Ultimately, I have splatters that I have pressed on my Too Many Records label that sound unbelievable. Silent, dynamic, perfect. And I have black records that sound like someone just went with a razor blade all over the top of them, even though it's fairly clean on top. So it really doesn't have to do with the color itself, unless you get super nuanced and you have a $7,000 turntable and you're listening with headphones and you're really trying to decipher the difference. Maybe you would tell a slight difference, but for 99% of your average listeners, you won't be able to tell a difference if you're looking at two records that are mastered properly and that they were cut well and the sources were good. If it's within the same run especially, a red record, a splatter record, and a black record are going to sound the same. Another piece of misinformation is that all picture discs sound terrible, and up until a certain point they did. I would say up until the 2010s, picture discs were inherently worse. The way that they made them, I guess they were pressing paper onto the record itself, and it just like looked cool but sounded bad. I don't know what's changed. I'm not involved with the actual pressing process, but I've received picture discs in the past 5 years that sound great. None of them sound audiophile. They're not going to be like an Analog Productions or MoFi pressing, but I have some that are completely dead silent and dynamic and they sound good. So no, not every picture disc sounds bad. It just depends on how it's made, the exact same way as the black and colored vinyl thing. So don't assume a picture disc is bad before getting it. Don't assume it's going to sound incredible, but odds are, if it's 2021, it's going to be listenable. And last but not least, there's a misconception that all vintage gear sounds better than new gear. When I first was starting this channel, I would recommend people to get vintage gear all the time. But that's because back in 2013, 14, 15, vinyl wasn't as insane as it is now in terms of everybody jumping in the hobby. You could find good deals on classic, high-quality gear on Craigslist, garage sales, etc. People hadn't really caught on to the fact that, oh, vinyl's a big thing now, and they started pricing and valuing their gear at, these high aftermarket values because they're good quality. I got my Pioneer from the 70s for $40 and the matching receiver for another $40. That was back in 2013. So those deals are long gone. Oftentimes vintage gear has a lot of issues with it, so you'll have to get replacement parts, you'll have to get a new needle, you have to get all sorts of things to make them work. Sometimes they have to even get serviced. So if you're willing to spend money on buying vintage gear and servicing it, you'd be just as good buying a good quality new turntable. Like when I got my Clearaudio Concept, it's a very expensive turntable, but it's perfect. It sounds better than my vintage gear did, and I love it. I think that it really depends on your price point and making sure that the gear you find is a good deal and it's not beat up and destroyed and needing all kinds of fixes, because it's sometimes just easier to get a new turntable and just plug it in and get going. Now, I'm not saying anything negative about vintage gear. I do love vintage equipment, but there are all those caveats that come with it that are worth telling someone who's new to the hobby. If you have any questions about these or any other kind of things you might have heard if you're new to the hobby, please leave a comment below. I'm happy to answer it for you. I just want the most people to get into this hobby in the most meaningful way possible, and I think that there's a lot of bad information out there, so I'm making this video in the hopes that it can help maybe clear the slate and get some more people into the hobby in the right way. So like I said, leave a comment if you're new, and if you're a veteran, drop something in the comments I might have forgotten. Thank you for watching this video. There's more coming soon, so I hope you subscribe and check out the rest of what I got. Take it easy.